Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Carrie Laboski about profitable nitrogen fertilizer rates in corn. Nitrogen is an important nutrient for corn, which, when applied as a fertilizer, can increase yields. However, too much nitrogen can lead to negative impacts on human health, plant health, water quality, and the environment. This episode, Carrie discusses her work testing nitrogen rate recommendation tools and how we can best balance profitability, plant health, and the environment. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but before we dive in, we wanted to thank our sponsors, starting with GasMat Technologies, the maker of the GT5000 Terra, the smallest portable FTIR multi-gas analyzer for greenhouse gas and environmental research. Measure carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ammonia, and water vapor in real time simultaneously from static or automated chambers and ruminant emissions. Visit www.gasmet.com, that's GasMat spelled G-A-S-M-E-T, or email sales@gasmet.com for more information. Our second sponsor is Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have Dr. Carrie Laboski with us. Carrie is a professor of soil science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research and extension education programs are focused on improving sustainability and resilience of agroecosystems through improved soil fertility and nutrient management practices. Dr. Laboski is a president-elect of the Soil Science Society of America. She earned her PhD and master's degrees in soil science from the University of Minnesota and a bachelor's in soil science from the Pennsylvania State University. Hi, Carrie. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you, Abby?
I am doing so well. So happy to have you on. Very excited. So today we are talking about nitrogen and kind of how it cycles and nitrogen fertilization rates and all that good stuff. So to get us started, can you introduce us to the cycles of nitrogen in the environment and how complicated that is and what it means for farmers trying to get nitrogen to their crops? Just kind of an overview of the whole problem.
Sure. And it is kind of a complex situation. So to think about from the farm standpoint, many of the crops that we grow, the non-leguminous crops like corn and wheat, need nitrogen fertilizer to improve their yield, to make it profitable for production. The challenge with that is that nitrogen is also an environmental contaminant if there's too much nitrogen in the environment. And so it's a problem in water, whether it's groundwater or surface water. And when we think about groundwater, often the biggest issue there is drinking water, although some people do have their public water systems or surface water. When you drink water with high nitrates, that can be an issue related to blue baby syndrome. And then also it's becoming, there's some links with cancers as well. And then if we think about surface water systems, nitrate in the bigger picture, from where I sit in Wisconsin, we're kind of not the headwaters of the Mississippi, but we're up in the upper Mississippi River basin. The nitrate can travel down from Wisconsin through the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico, and it can create some ecosystem problems in the Gulf where it will negatively impact fisheries and the like down there. It's called the hypoxic zone, and it's very large, and it's a problem. We also have problems with nitrogen in the environment with regard to air. Nitrous oxide we know is a greenhouse gas that contributes to climate change. So when we're thinking about nitrogen cycling in the environment, we need to be thinking about these different losses to air and water that have negative consequences. And so to think a little bit about how nitrogen cycles in the soil is important, because if a plant is taking up nitrogen, it's taking up inorganic forms. This is nitrate and ammonium. And these two forms are plant available, but they don't just sit in the soil by themselves. There's a lot of cycling that goes on. In fact, most of the nitrogen in the soil is in an organic form, and that's not readily taken up by plants. And so we have this cycling that occurs that's largely mediated by soil microbes, where they convert organic nitrogen to ammonium, and then which the plant can take up, or it's held in the soil, or they can convert, because the cycle keeps moving along, convert ammonium to nitrate. Plants can use nitrate, but it also can be lost. That's the key part of this system, is that nitrate can be leached through the soil and into groundwater or drainage tile lines. And it can be, when the soil is soggy wet in those conditions and anaerobic, we can have different set of microbes working, where we have a process called denitrification, and that converts nitrate to nitrous oxide, the greenhouse gas. And then there's another group of bacteria that will take nitrate and ammonium and incorporate them back into soil organic nitrogen. So all of this is going on all the time. Factors that affect it are related to temperature, moisture, soil pH. Things that when we think about temperature and moisture, there's conditions where we as humans are happy, and there's conditions where different sorts of soil microbes are happy. And in different environmental conditions, some microbes will take over, and then in the conditions shift, others will. And so this changing oxygen status of the soil related to how wet the soil is will shift whether we have aerobic conditions and aerobic bacteria working versus anaerobic conditions going on. And so it's a pretty complex cycle, and it relates to the amount of nitrogen that the soil can supply natively to a plant. And with the losses that can occur from the system, and some of those losses are driven by precipitation, excess precipitation, it makes it really challenging to determine how much nitrogen the soil will be able to supply for, say, a corn crop in any given year.
So basically, farmers are in a constant position of trying to figure out whether they're dealing with aerobic or anaerobic conditions, as well as how much nitrogen is there, how much is going to be potentially lost, whether that's through nitrous oxide to the atmosphere or washed away. But there's also kind of an economic factor to be considered here with applying fertilizers to, supplement what's available. So can you talk about that part too?
Sure. So when we think about growing a corn crop, the soil will supply, in some environments, like I work in Wisconsin, can supply a majority of the nitrogen needed by the crop. But in order to be profitable, farmers need to apply some fertilizer nitrogen to boost the yields up a little bit more. And so a simple way of thinking about that is you have the amount of nitrogen that's needed that the plant takes up, and then you subtract from that the amount of nitrogen the soil supplies, and you arrive at the fertilizer nitrogen rate, which seems pretty straightforward and simple math, just basic subtraction. But the problem is we still have a lot of black boxes to some extent in this. Plant nitrogen uptake can vary with environment and the hybrid grown, if we're talking about corn, and then that soil and supply or nitrogen supply can vary a lot. And so it's a little bit challenging to determine nitrogen need. And the other thing to keep in mind is that applying more nitrogen does not mean more yield. There's limits on that. And so we know in general that as you apply more nitrogen, corn yield will increase to a point and then it flattens off. And that's really key, is that it's not just a sort of a straight line going up, is that it flattens off. And so we don't want to apply more nitrogen or to the point where what we call the yield curve flattens off. If we apply more than that, we're just putting more fertilizer down that the crop's not using, and that means that that's potentially can be lost to the environment if the crop's not using it. And farmers are losing money, because if you don't increase your yield and you spent money, you're losing money. And it's also important to point out as well that the most profitable rate of nitrogen fertilizer, or what we might call the economic optimum rate, is not the rate where you just hit that plateau in yield. It's actually a rate that's a little bit lower because the slope of the curve is fairly shallow, so that you're putting more nitrogen on, but the yield increase becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. We call it the law of diminishing returns. And so the economic optimum rate, or most profitable rate, is a little bit less than when we hit that yield plateau. And so that's what we're trying to help growers is develop. Universities are trying to develop recommendations or guidelines for growers to help them hit that most profitable rate, because it'll be profitable for them. But we also know through a variety of research that when we apply nitrogen fertilizer in excess of what the crop is going to use, that's just left over in the environment. And the more excess you have, the greater potential pollution you have. And so trying to help growers really get towards that most profitable rate is important, because work has shown that applying nitrogen at the most profitable rate doesn't necessarily leave more nitrogen to be lost than, say, under applying nitrogen. It's the kind of opposite sort of curves, the yield curve versus the potential loss curve.
Sure. Yeah, obviously a lot to balance on the scales, and a crucial issue that impacts, obviously, farmers' livelihoods, the environment, our ability to feed people. So very important, to which you participated in an extremely large project to study maybe how to best figure out that optimum economic rate, how to best test to make sure that we know what's there or what needs to be added. So can you tell us about both your goals for this larger project and also how you were able to get it off the ground, pull it together, get everybody in the same room that needed to be together, and really pull such a huge project together?
Sure. I really can't take much credit for pulling the project together. I had some amazing colleagues, and the project was funded by Pioneer. So the people that produce corn hybrids. And so their initial idea was they knew that they needed more information about corn response to nitrogen and how the environment impacts it. And so their vision was to pull together researchers from the Midwest to start talking about it and develop a project. And so they did that. They invited folks from 8 states. So we had, if I can get them, they won't be in alphabetical order, they'll be how I think of the map. North Dakota, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, and Nebraska. So those are our 8 Midwestern states. It was most folks were from the land-grant university in their state, and in Missouri it was a partnership between University of Missouri and USDA Ag Research Service. And so we worked together because we knew that there was a challenge having good data sets over broad geographies to understand corn nitrogen response. And the tools that we have, or developing new tools to help farmers get a better handle on nitrogen fertilizer need. And so that's how it originally came together. So we had 8 states. The study occurred over a 3-year period of time. Each state had 2 sites in each year, except Missouri. They were overachievers. They had 3 sites in 1 year. And so we ended up with what we call 49 site years of data across this broad geography in the Midwest. And what's also interesting about the broad geography is there is a precipitation gradient as you go from the northwest to the southeast, and obvious temperature gradients when you're talking about Missouri and Nebraska compared to Minnesota and Wisconsin, North Dakota too. So we had some changes there, and then our soils are different throughout the region. So we have a lot of things happening in that realm, and that was one of the points of having the broad geography, is to better understand if we're all doing the same thing in research plots, what kind of results do we get when we have different soils and climate. And so we did that. We sat down and hammered out a combined protocol that everybody did the same thing in the field. And it was kind of a fairly basic study, but it was a lot of sampling and a lot of work. We had different nitrogen fertilizer rates applied at side dress time. So that would be in season when the corn was about at the 9-leaf stage. And then we also had a set of rates where 40 pound per acre rate was applied at planting, and then the remainder at side dress. So it was a split application. So we could look at things like timing of application and application rate. How does that impact yield? We took a lot of soil samples, pre-plant, in season, post-harvest. We had some crop sensors going on, that they're canopy reflectance sensors. To basically, the easy way to think about it is to measure the greenness. Some people maybe have heard the term normalized difference vegetation index, NDVI. And there's some indices that we can do with that greenness. How does that work as a tool? And so using the data collected at all of these sites, and I should note, we also had weather stations at each site to make sure we had good accounting of rainfall and temperature. And so using this data, we could very simply plot graphs that were nitrogen fertilizer rate on the x-axis versus, and that's the horizontal axis for other folks, versus corn grain yield on the y-axis, or the vertical axis. And you get that classic response: yield increases and then levels off. And we could fit mathematical models to that, and then from there determine the economic optimum end rate at each site. And so we had sites that needed high amounts of nitrogen, and we had some sites that didn't need any at all. And we've run into those before. They're not, these unicorns that are out there. And the sites where there's no nitrogen fertilizer is needed, those are the ones that we, in my mind, are the most important ones to identify, because if you don't know that your field is not going to respond to nitrogen, or only needs a very tiny bit, and you put what we call a full rate on, that is a lot of extra nitrogen that will be lost to the environment. And so that's really gets at the crux of looking at all of this.
Great. All right, I have several questions off of this. So, first question is, I know you were looking at different kinds of end recommendation tools, or maybe end predictive tools. I'm sure that's not the correct term, so please correct me. But where does that fit in the process? Were you, for example, using a specific test before you even planted to try and figure out these rates? Was it after harvest? Where did those fit into this?
Okay, that's a great question. And so how we evaluated the performance of different end recommendation tools was post hoc. And so meaning that we had this rate trial out in all of these fields, and we can fit that model and calculate the economic optimum end rate. And we take that information and then compare it. Because we have this response curve or model, we can say, okay, well, this recommendation tool would have told us to apply 150 pounds of nitrogen, and we actually needed 170 pounds of nitrogen at the site. And so using the model, we could then say, well, if we had applied 150 pounds, this is the amount of yield we would have gotten. And then we can do a variety of calculations that way. And so instead of, because another way would be like you described, that you put out actual treatment based on sort of the tool. But we ran it as a trial, so then you could test a variety of tools off that model.
Okay, so then when you were applying these rates, I mean, we presumably at this point, we understand, if a plant has too much nitrogen, that might manifest in this way, such as yellow leaves or stunted growth or, whatever it is. Please don't anybody cite me on that. I'm sure that's not what it is necessarily. Or if it has too little. So you can kind of apply these different rates and then know for whatever specific site you were on whether or not you were kind of close to what would be a good rate. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, that's partly correct. We do that to some extent. So when we have these different rates of nitrogen applied, we had 0 up to 240 pounds of nitrogen per acre applied in different rates. And these are in small plots across the field, and they're replicated plots. And, when you're doing studies like this, you're walking through these fields, before the corn even merges right up until harvest. And so you can watch them grow and change over time. And what we often will see is that when no nitrogen's applied or lower rates, at some point during the growing season, we'll start seeing the growth start to lag the other plots that have higher fertilizer rates. So they'll start becoming a little bit smaller. The lower leaves will start becoming yellow and start browning up. And so a term that we often use is the corn is firing. And so that means that you don't have enough nitrogen, and so nitrogen is moving out of the lower plant leaves into the upper plant leaves. And so that's a visual symptom of deficiency. And a very green crop just means that the nitrogen is sufficient or maybe excessive. We don't necessarily really have any visuals on too much N from that standpoint. And so, we have, visual assessments, but then when we come through at harvest time, we harvest all these little plots individually and we measure the grain yield. And so we look at how did the grain yield increase for each nitrogen fertilizer rate that we applied. And then that's how we fit a numerical model to calculate the economic optimum rate for that site. And it's using that response model that we can test these scenarios of, well, what if this recommendation tool told us to put on 150 pounds and that tool told us to put on 170 pounds, and then what if we actually needed 160 pounds from the response curve? So that's how we do the comparisons.
everyone. I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Carrie and her colleagues have already published over a dozen articles on this research. You can find a list of related papers for this episode in our show notes. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Thanks again also to our sponsors, Meter Group and Gasmet Technologies. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. For Gasmet Technologies, the GT5000 Terra is a robust and portable multi-gas analyzer for fieldwork weighing 20.7 pounds. The GT5000 Terra is splash-proof IP54 rated with an internal pump and battery and instantaneous readings of up to 50 gases at sub-ppm concentrations. Check out the quick setup guide and learn more about Gasmet Technologies at www.gasmet.com and the links in the show notes. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. Okay, so each plot is kind of like a point on your x-axis then when you measure the yield from that. Okay. You said that before, but in a different way, and now it's just clicking for me, so I'm sorry I was a little slow to catch up. But that's very helpful for me. So basically then once you have your chart based on the field trials, then you can take maybe characteristics of your field that these predictive tools are measuring and, you know, feed that data into the tools, and then they kind of spit back out what they think you should apply based on those conditions. Is that kind of how that works?
Yep, a little bit. So we tested a variety of tools. And so some of them are, and they're all tools that are used by at least one of the land-grant universities in the region that we were working. And so one tool is this, what we call the MRTN, or Maximum Return to Nitrogen tool. It's a tool that many of the states use to provide guidance to growers. And it essentially, how it works in Wisconsin is you have to use a table and you look at features of previous crop and soil, and you get and the nitrogen to corn price ratio. It gets into economics, and then from that table you pull out, here's my recommended rate. Other states using that approach, it might be a little bit different, but it kind of boils down to a similar sort of thing. Some other tools that we tested were more of a yield goal type approach, and that's where you just look at past yield history on a field, and there's a factor that you multiply that yield. So let's say it was a 200 bushel field, and you'd have a factor, maybe it's a factor of 1, or an old factor you used to see was 1.2, and it would say then that's how much nitrogen to apply. Sometimes there's some of these yield goal methods start with something like that, and then they subtract things off. So those were some of the tools we tested. We tested a variety of what I'll just lump it in and say is nitrate testing tools, and soil nitrate testing. And so some of those soil nitrate tests were related to samples collected to 3 feet prior to planting corn. And so a lot of effort goes into collecting a 3-foot soil sample, especially if you hit a few rocks along the way. And then others of the nitrate testing tools we evaluated were related to sampling at side dress time. So that's that in-season nitrogen fertilizer application. So taking samples just prior to that. And those are all methods that universities have some guidance for growers to use things like that. We tested a method or a tool with a crop canopy reflectance sensor using the University of Missouri. They have an algorithm for using the sensor to predict a nitrogen rate. And then University of Nebraska has a model, Maze N it's called, and that you input information and it tells you. So there's a variety of ways to that these tools work. And so we kind of pulled all this information together and how to use each of these tools, and then for each particular site applied the tool. What would the tool have told us for a nitrogen rate? And then we could, from that response graph or model, we can get the yield level associated with it to then calculate, well, how profitable would it be? Do we think there'd be a lot of excess N left and such?
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I feel like we've gotten a good idea of how these all flow together, from getting initial data, using that to compare to recommendations or kind of calibrate them a little almost. So what did you find about all of these N rates and recommendation tools and spoiler alert, extra tests that you did? Can you tell me about all those?
Sure. I think, it was interesting because these sites, we had just this range of economic optimum N rates that occurred across all the sites. 0 all the way up. I forget what the highest rate would have been. It might have been 200 pounds of N. So a big range. And so it provided a good opportunity to really test the robustness of these different publicly available tools that we have today. And so one of the first things we did was look at just how close did the recommendation from the tool come to the actual economic optimum N rate for the site. And so, in looking at that, we had some tools that performed a little bit better than other tools. But there's a lot and there were some tools that over-recommended nitrogen, others under-recommended nitrogen, and then there was a group that did a pretty good job getting close to the economic optimum nitrogen rate. We also evaluated these tools for their profitability. How much money would you have made using the tool? And so there's a couple things that go into that. One is just, for the amount of nitrogen that you applied, how much yield would you have gotten? What would be the value of that yield? Then you have to subtract off the cost of the fertilizer. And then using some of these tools is not free. There's a cost to using the tool, so we'd have to subtract that off. And so, for example, the MRTN guidelines that several states use, that would be sort of a free tool. It's out there. You don't have to do anything extra for it. You just use it. Something that would involve soil nitrate testing, that has some greater expense to it because somebody has to go out, collect the sample, and then you have to send it to a lab and get it analyzed. And so we factored in those expenses. And then something like the crop canopy reflectance sensors, you have cost of the technology and all of that. And so when we looked at what we called the partial profit of the tools, largely a lot of the tools perform very similarly to each other. Some were kind of a little better than others, but statistically we couldn't sort most of them out. We did find that the model, the Maze N model, did not do very well. And it's just partly because it under-recommended a lot of nitrogen, and therefore we had a lot of yield loss there. And so, profitability, a lot of the sameness amongst the tools. And then we also evaluated the potential environmental costs related to the tools. And that's really getting at sort of the excess N that is, if you over applied nitrogen, what would be the environmental costs? And some tools performed better than others as well. And when we look broadly at sort of all three of these measures, there was no single recommendation tool that was universally reliable across the Midwest. And to some extent, that's not surprising because we've got a big geography, a lot of different soils, and then when we look at these tools, they've often been calibrated for use, say, in their own state. And so then when you start trying to extrapolate them to another state, it kind of makes sense. They might break down. One of the things that was really interesting is that there were several tools that used soil nitrate testing that performed reasonably well. And so that's really suggesting that soil testing might be a good way to help make some adjustments. I was pretty pleased to see that the Wisconsin approach to using the pre-sidrus nitrate test performed pretty well. And I think part of that is not just taking the nitrate test, but it's using some of our recommendations as well, as far as you don't get the same nitrogen credit if you're on all soil types. So certain soils, for the same soil test value, you get one credit on some soils and a different credit on another. So it's a little more soil specific. And so that's kind of how we evaluated all of these different tools. And it would have been nice if we had one real winner, but we didn't.
Yeah, there never seems to be a silver bullet in any of these sciences. Here's a question. Is there... I mean, it seems to me like potentially you could kind of calibrate these. Like you said, that one that was underestimating. Is it unreasonable to think that someone could say at some point, this regularly tends to underestimate by 30 pounds or something, and just go ahead and add 30 and hope for the best? I mean, what is the benefit of using multiple tools versus trying to more accurately calibrate one? Or, I mean, is that a reasonable area of research for the future? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a combination because, like you said, if one tool's not doing well, just add more. Well, that means it's probably not calibrated well. And it might be that one calibration for everybody isn't good. You need to look at more regionally specific kind of calibrations. And so that's kind of, the way to move forward. And it might be opportunities really to combine methods. And so one thing that we looked at, one of the graduate students on the project was looking at the crop sensors and saw how well the algorithm was performing, and then did some additional work and said, well, what if we started adding in some information about soil and weather? And using that information about precipitation as well as clay content of the soil, if I remember correctly, that the performance of the recommendations from the sensor could be improved. And so it's not just calibrating it, it's improving the calibration by adding in other pieces, making it a more complex tool. And so that was done with the sensors. And then also when we started thinking about, the soil nitrate tests look pretty good, started saying, are there other soil tests that might be able to help us as well?
All right. So then I know there are other next steps for you and this project. So where is the research going? What is the future of this project or others?
Well, we had a lot of stuff going on with this project. We only just touched the surface of it. Some of the things that we have also done with the soil samples collected is we started evaluating some other soil tests. I was talking about, current recommendation tools, and they're largely based on nitrate testing. But we looked at potentially mineralizable nitrogen and soil respiration tests. What could they tell us? And we learned some things about nitrogen mineralization from that. But one of the bottom line aspects was that neither of them was going to be a good tool by themselves. To just measure soil respiration, which would be kind of an indicator of biological activity, or potentially mineralizable nitrogen would be, that's like your soil and supply. They seem like they should be really good predictors of fertilizer need, and they weren't as good as what you would have hoped. So we just keep plugging away. We learn more. We learn through this study that if we think about those tests not by themselves, but how, again, like we did with the canopy sensor, what if we were adding in information about the soil? What about the soil texture is telling us? Maybe drainage class is helping us out. Could information about precipitation improve using the test? So it was moving things forward nicely. What's kind of interesting is all of this was going on, I was involved with another group of researchers, and there was a couple of us that overlapped between the two projects. And we had data that was actually quite old. It was the field research had been conducted in the mid-1990s, and there was a whole bunch of soil tests that were measured at that time. There was 30 of them, and they were different measures of inorganic and different ways to get at soil nitrate and ammonium. There was biological tests, tests of mineralizable nitrogen, because there's all different ways you can perform these tests too. So it's just like making your favorite sugar cookie recipe. Everybody's got a slightly different recipe, right? And then if you're making chocolate chip cookies, that seems like that's even more diverse on how you do it. And so that's exactly what these lab tests are like, is everybody's got their own recipe and you're trying to improve it, so you change it up. And so we had these 30 tests, and so it was a different set of sites, 25 years earlier on the field research, the lab work had been done, but with some different statistical methods that people are using today. We started looking at that data again and saying, what can we tease anything out of it or learn anything new? And we did learn some things new. So while this bigger project was going on, this other one was going on as well, and we found that combining different tests was pretty useful. That using an anaerobic incubation test, we can kind of sort out certain sites that maybe didn't respond to nitrogen and those that did, and then using another method that gets at an extraction of ammonium in soil, maybe we could actually predict the fertilizer need for fields. And it seemed reasonable. It's not the end all and be all, but it really shows that combining some of these tests might really help things out. And if we could then factor in some things like soil drainage class or texture on top of that, we maybe could have some decision trees to help people improve, for us to give better guidance to growers, and they can be more profitable and we can do a better job environmentally.
Sure. That sounds like a great set of projects, great progress made and still yet to be made. So that's very exciting. I don't want to take up your whole day, though, so I've only got 3 questions left for you. The first is, if people want to learn more about this topic or these projects, where can they go?
Well, if you're just super excited about learning more about nitrogen management in general, not necessarily specific about these particular projects, but the topic very broadly, I have some YouTube videos on nitrogen management that are put together as part of some training that we do in our extension. And so if you want to get at them, probably the easiest way really is to go into YouTube and search Carrie Laboski, UW, and nitrogen, and they'll pop up. But I think in the links to this podcast, we can drop a few of the direct links as well. There's a few research papers. So far from this larger project that we talked about, there's been 17 journal papers published on it, which is incredible. I still don't believe it. And we have more that are still in progress. But there's a few that I think might be interesting, and I mentioned pieces of them, and so we can drop those in the notes to the podcast as well. So it would be kind of, if you want to learn a little bit more about the projects or nitrogen in general.
Absolutely. We will definitely include links for all of those in our show notes. Second question is, if people then want to take the next step and get involved in this kind of research or project, what can they do?
Well, if this is super exciting to you, depending on where you are at in life, if you are at a point where you're interested in pursuing a degree, whether it's a bachelor's degree, maybe you're interested in moving on to a graduate degree, a master's or PhD, there's a lot of opportunities out there, degree programs. So if you're thinking, say you're a high school student and you're saying, this is interesting, sign me up, So some degree programs that you'd be interested in looking for would be titles that might be something like soil science or agronomy, agroecosystem science, or maybe environmental science. Those are the areas that would be that you'd be able to find, learn more about the subject. And if you're pursuing graduate degrees, broadly, all the folks that I've worked with on these projects, we largely consider ourselves soil fertility and or nutrient management specialist. That's kind of our area. And so that would be kind of within soil science to break down a little bit more of kind of where I fit in.
Excellent. That is great advice. Final question is, what is one fun fact that listeners would not know about you if all they had was your research?
Well, I think the most interesting fun fact is that my husband and I enjoy the outdoors a lot. We like hiking and camping, paddling, and especially camping and traveling in our travel trailer and really experiencing America off the interstate.
Sure. That sounds very fun. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. We really appreciate having you on the show, and thanks for all that you do.
You're welcome. Have a great day, Abby.
You too. Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.